There's no beauty here, only death and decay.
Welcome to The Beauty of Horror, a podcast dedicated to exploring the unsettling beauty found within our favorite genre. Each episode, I will sit down with a different guest to discuss a horror film they find particularly beautiful and why. I'm your host, Chandler Bullock, and today's guest is a columnist and writer for Talk Film Society and Daily Grindhouse, with bylines at Bloody Disgusting, We Are Horror, and Rue Morgue. He is also the host of the upcoming Lovin Uwe, that's U, as in Uwe Bowl, podcast. Beautiful greetings to Greg Mucci.
Hey, how's it going?
Going pretty well. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we begin, I do like to start things off with a brief quote that kind of pertains to our topic. Usually this comes from either philosophy, filmmakers, whatever. And I'll give more context on that a little bit later. But today's quote is, all things, well, almost all things, can trigger aesthetic engagement. And there is nothing, not even the greatest artwork, that will always do so. The big question is how we can explain this kind of aesthetic engagement and the way it is triggered. I'll reveal who said this a little bit later, but first, Greg, I want to talk with you about your relationship with horror and, how you kind of got started with it. And maybe I want to talk a little bit about that podcast too. But first, let's talk about, where did this fascination with horror come from?
I think it started sort of how it does with most people. A parental unit or friend of the family or a friend or sort of passes it down to you. And I think that's what I love about it, the horror genre. It always sort of feels like a used paperback novel that you sort of, lend to someone and they lend it to someone, and it's just sort of, radiates outwards. And I was kind of shown like Frankenstein, Wolfman, a lot of the Universal monsters as a kid, and there was something very sort of age-friendly about them. And they definitely scared me. Sort of Henry Talbot being turned into a werewolf in Wolfman, and I know people sort of, scrutinize Lon Chaney's Jr.'s performance as being a little bit overly sympathetic or maybe over the top, but I loved it because I did think as a kid that those two contrasts worked really well in showing me what horror can embody. You got the sympathetic and you have the sort of grotesque, and that's what I loved about those movies and sort of what they tapped into. But it wasn't until I was shown The Shining at the age of 7.
Holy crap.
That I was also shown Nightmare on Elm Street, the original, when I was 7. It just came sort of after this, because my dad worked as a chef at Yale University, and so he would work with a lot of sort of younger people who just sort of, were really into the VHS horror craze of the 80s, and they would just sort of record stuff. So my dad was sort of, and granted, I was 7 in 1993, so my dad would come home with a lot of blank VHS tapes of people who had just recorded things that they caught on USA, to sort of,
right,
things that I didn't really tap into much, unless it was October, and there was a lot of, shots from like Halloween 4 and 5 and what they were playing through marathons, but they would sort of record it and hand it to my dad. Bad Moon was one of them, which was sort of always put on the high shelf for me not to watch. But my dad, came home with a blank VHS tape, and it was The Shining. And I had a friend over, Avery Sears, and we both watched it. And it was, it's hard to say if it was a good time. We both enjoyed watching it, but the succession of events afterwards included my friend waking up screaming and us having to drive him home. And then I had a nightmare of the woman in room 237, and I woke up crying. And it was just like one of those things that, sort of traumatized you, because from age 7 to pretty much when I was in 8th grade, so we're looking at maybe 13, 14, I checked behind the shower every single time I went into the bathroom. And I would just, it was just really unsettling. But that sort of opened me up to just the expanse of the genre and like what it can do, because I do, as traumatic as that was, it was an experience, something that it left a deafening imprint, and it was also just sort of, cathartic in a way. I mean, adolescence is, terrifying, and as somebody who is incessantly bullied at school, it was great to sort of have that be forcibly removed from me by choice. And yeah, that was sort of, and that's, it's sort of why The Shining is my favorite horror film of all time. And, Nightmare on Elm Street to me is, despite my love for John Carpenter, probably the best slasher of the group. But yeah, that sort of kicked it off. But yeah, I didn't really get into the genre on my own until I was probably like 21. I mean, I didn't watch all the Friday the 13th until, that age. But yeah, it was just like, here and there. But yeah, that was, it started early, and it's been a bumpy road, but yeah.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's life, right? A bunch of bumps on the road, and you either get back on the road or you fall in a ditch sometimes, I suppose.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm very curious now then, since you had such a strong response to The Shining, did you feel yourself kind of veering away from the genre for a while when you're still younger? Or, like, maybe your parent, like, did they kind of try to shelter you a bit more away from it? Or did you just actively go, I don't want to watch these, or were you still just fine if a horror movie was on?
I mean, I think that night with The Shining definitely stunted my parents or at least my dad in his enthusiasm to show me things, because I think that I don't know if it was like a warning sign, but I mean, is 7 too young to show The Shining? Yes.
A little bit.
Absolutely. It was definitely my first full frontal nudity.
Right.
I mean, elevators of blood. It's just a terrifying film. I definitely think that there are some, the horror films that are applicable to an early age, or at least they can sort of steer you in the right direction. I feel like this probably showed them that what they were doing might be incorrect. So yeah,
right.
a lot of the VHS tapes that were brought home sort of stopped. I remember one time I was like about maybe 12, and I found a copy of Reservoir Dogs along with Bad Moon, all sort of tucked away somewhere. And I don't think Reservoir Dogs is more violent than The Shining, but I think it was one of those, we definitely can't show him this until he is a certain age, because my parents wouldn't let me watch Pulp Fiction when it came out in '94, despite me watching from like a doorway in the shadows when they were watching it. And it's just, it didn't steer me, it steered my parents. And thus,
right.
When you're a kid, you're not behind the wheel. But even when I started, when I was able to drive myself, I would go to the movies a lot, and I'd go and see Kill Bill. I would just go to the movies a lot as a kid, and it wasn't horror specific. I think that it took me a bit to tap further into the genre, like through, the 40s, 50s, 60s, like the classics. I was definitely a lot more into just trashier horror films. I was definitely into like, Tales from the Crypt, Bordello of Blood.
Nice,
it's not the better of the two. Demon Knight is by and far like a much better film, but I got into like John Carpenter, but it wasn't until later where I started to get into Argento and Mario Bava, and and I think by the time 2009 came around, or 2005, I was really into the House of Wax remake. And then I think what really showed me or established my love for the genre was 2009 when Jennifer's Body came out. It was just a movie that I just loved through and through, and I thought it was scary, it was funny, it just tapped into all those aspects that I sort of found missing in horror, because I wasn't really shown horror comedies, or at least horror with like a funny bone, as much as I whenever they show sort of restorations or even prints of The Shining and I go see it, it's newer audiences I think find it a bit more comical than it's intended, and it's a bit disappointing, but I don't really think that there's that much humor in The Shining. But yeah, no, I definitely, I don't know, I had to find my way back, and I think that it was a long winding road, but I'm happy with being 35 and still discovering movies like Ticks or Alligator. It's Like I
Whoa, hold on. I'm sorry to interrupt you here. Was Alligator a recent first-time watch for you?
No.
Because I would be amazing if it were. I love that movie, and that for me was like so. Sorry, it's just I'm loving. I'm like because I'm also letting you go for a while because I'm loving to hear this. You have a very similar pathway that I had. Different movies, of course, but I had that I was very easily scared as a child. So my mom was like, "Well, I don't really like this horror stuff anyway, so I'm just not going to put him around it."
Yeah.
And I kept gravitating towards it just naturally. My dad really liked it, but after they divorced, she got more of a say in what I got to watch and stuff. So she sheltered me a bit from it, but it just didn't stop. It was kind of in my blood, it seemed, to want to terrify myself. And something like Alligator for me is just like one of those, like, I don't know if you remember like the old Sci-Fi Channel back in like the late 90s, early 2000s. So before it was SYFY. Yeah. So they showed really good stuff on Sci-Fi back in the day. And Alligator was shown a lot. It was just one of those monster movie night kind of things. So if I was sick at home on a Thursday, I was probably having some massive fever watching something like Alligator or Orca or something like that.
Yeah, Boar.
And so just hearing about it made me really excited.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear, like, because I cannot wait to see it again now that I'm older and would understand it better.
Well, and now it's getting a 4K release.
Yes.
I'm not ashamed to say that, a lot of the older films weren't in my like immediacy. They weren't like I had no real proximity to them, and that they were always sort of I discovered them through like Lake Placid when that came out. I watched Lake Placid, or things like Anaconda, and like the newer 90s sort of danger nature, creatures gone wild sort of phase of the mid to late 90s. Like that's what opened the doors for me to things from the late 70s and the 80s. And and I think that's what I love about horror, is that every movie that comes out is a gateway to something prior. And I don't think that you're any less of a fan for having not seen or grown up with, things like Boar or like it just, Piranha. And I mean, like I watched the Piranha remake before I, even watched Piranha, and I still haven't seen Piranha 2, It's just like there's just so much out there, and especially now with like, quote unquote content, and it's like the amount of things made for Shudder or for Amazon. I'm like, I have barely watched anything from 2021. I think I've seen 30 movies.
Me neither.
And it's like I'm still trying to watch movies from the 70s, and and that's what I will do with Severn Black Friday sales. Like I picked up Night of the Demon because
nice.
I think how many I've seen, maybe 2 Bigfoot movies in my life, if you want to count Berserker, but like I use the Criterion sale to pick up Blind Buys. There's just so much out there, and it's what I love about horror is that while I'm still familiarizing myself with the genre through the classics, there's so much great stuff being made that in 10, 15 years, I'll discover it, and it will be, in its own loose terms, a classic. And then so in that mind frame, you're sort of always discovering classics. And yeah, there's a lot of trash out there. There's a lot of trash for every genre, but I don't know. I didn't finish watching. I haven't even seen all the Hellraisers, and there's nothing, that's no slight against me or the Hellraiser films, but it's just, you find things on your own path and in your own life, and I think forcing the genre, like The Shining was kind of forced on me when I was 7, it can be a bit dangerous, and I don't think danger necessarily equates to wrong or, but it's just, that's the beauty about it. I look forward to what horror I will discover when I'm 40, thinking, oh, well, I should have seen that when I was 8.
It is a continuous journey. I love that about it as well. And just to be clear as well, like I was just super excited because I would love to hear somebody's perspective who got to see Alligator when they kind of understood movies better. See, there are a lot of classics that I've seen just because they were on Sci-Fi, basically.
Yeah.
And, at that time, you don't know you're watching a classic. You just think you're watching one of the trash movies that's coming on to fill up airtime, basically. And you're like, this is entertaining enough. I want to watch this. And it's not until you realize that you have a nostalgic feeling towards it, it kind of turns into a classic. So one, like they say, one man's trash is another man's treasure. I think it totally applies to the breadth and scope of this genre because, I mean, if you look at figures like Rebecca McKendry, for instance, she is the queen of deep dives, and she will give you some deep cuts, and they're all like horribly trashy and wonderful because there are people who are putting their imagination on screen, and we get to celebrate cinema through them.
Oh, yeah.
So there's always some value to it all. And like you, a lot of the classics I'm just now seeing as well. Like Argento, I think I saw Suspiria for the first time when I was about 25.
Oh, awesome.
I didn't see The Shining until I was about 22. I think it's for university I saw it. But I had wanted to, but never had the opportunity to since they just didn't have it in our video stores. And yeah, luck of the draw sometimes, right? And like you, I also, when it came to classics growing up, it was the older movies. I think there's just some kind of pull for certain kids that were like, I want to be that kid that really knows how it all started, to just kind of challenge yourself to appreciate it, I guess. Really try to understand it and not just see it as an old thing. And if you can do that, you can enjoy just about anything.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with Little Shop of Horror and with the Rick Moranis one.
Okay.
And it's like, it's one of my all-time favorite films, and I love the practical effects and sort of the puppetry of it. And a few years ago, I saw for the first time Deadly Spawn at a horror marathon, and it didn't quite click with me, but I thought, oh, if I saw this at the age where I saw Little Shop of Horror, I would absolutely love it. And it's, some, like, I watched The Suckling for the first time like 5 years ago, and I hated it. But there are people who absolutely love it. I mean, there's a reason Vinegar Syndrome, puts this out. There's a market for it. And I think that people who are fans of cult horror, they never really want it to be mainstream necessarily. Like they covet it. They love that it's this thing that bonds them and a handful of other versus the masses who will go and see it. And I think that the horror genre more than ever has that, and I think that's what makes sort of finding like-minded people and people like you could become friends with. I think that's, I mean, before this we were talking about Bloodborne and Sekiro, and that those are two games that are not for everybody. And
True.
And I think that, finding people who explore those games and love those games, like that's part of the beauty of it. And same with finding people who don't think The Suckling sucks. And,
Exactly.
and they're out there, and it's not for me to say, that they're right or wrong. And it's just one of those things where, yeah, I love to uncover more things that I think little Greg would have easily been a fan of, and and that's why I love the question of what got you into horror. It's always going to be different, and it's like that with most everything. But the thing about horror is that it's something that shouldn't necessarily be shown to young kids, and so it's how did that make an impression? And usually, it's a huge impression.
For sure. Even if you don't know it. In my case, I get to say this in my own podcast for once. Because I've had the question on a few appearances as well. I saw it for when I was 3 when it came out, 1990. So like my dad was just watching it on, I think it came out on ABC. I'm not going to get too caught up if that's what the channel was, but it was on one of those syndication kind of network channels. And it didn't really faze me, it seemed. I was a big Bozo the Clown fan, so I was just kind of like, when it got me was the stuff like the werewolf, the spider, the very classic creepy stuff. Obviously when he had teeth and everything, but the mere fact that it was a clown, that didn't get me. I liked clowns. So the impact that movie has had on so many other people who saw it young is a lot different for me, but it doesn't mean that other things didn't completely wreck me when I saw them at a much older age. Like I saw Jurassic Park at the age of 7, big dinosaur fan, and it just destroyed me. Screaming in the cinema, my mom's covering my ears, and just like, this was the worst decision I have made so far to take the 7-year-old to this damn dinosaur horror movie. So, because we didn't know, we thought it was going to be exciting. We didn't think it was going to be the most terrifying thing Steven Spielberg had made up to that point, basically.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I love it now, but I do still get the same tension. Do you still get that with The Shining as well? Like those moments that are coming up and you're like you say, little Greg, in my case, like little Chandler is just kind of like, here we go.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've seen it more times than I can count, really. So it's definitely like a sort of a DNA film. It's just sort of ingrained in me. And those are a lot of the tracking shots, a lot of the dolly shots. Like it still carries with it that sort of impending doom that is just pushing you towards. And I don't think I could ever get away from that. I think the older I get, the more I sort of textualize Wendy, and Danny, like the characters themselves don't necessarily become more relatable, but they become more understanding. And I guess as an adult, the situation that they're placed in, because when you watch it and you're 7, the character that you sort of tap into is Danny.
Yeah, of course.
And but I did look it up though. Yeah, it was ABC, aired November 18th through the 20th in 1990. So it was broken up into 2 parts. But the thing that was I was never an It miniseries fan. There were moments that I thought were very chilling. I just didn't really gravitate to the characters as much.
I get that.
But I think what I love about that, and sort of harkening back to the way my dad would bring home blank VHS tapes, was that this was a movie that came in a stacked double VHS.
Yeah.
And there was something so intimidating about that.
Look at this terrifying cover, and look how long you have to experience this. Yeah. It's like a threat.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I don't know. I kind of miss that about... there's a lot of great packaging for releases out there now, but I kind of liked it. You'd go to the video store as a kid and you would see the cover art for Nightmare on Elm Street on the NES. It was just something very terrifying about it, especially the cardboard cutouts for Dream Warrior, because you'd have that worm, the Freddy worm. Yeah, there was just something very intimidating about that VHS that I think is kind of in some ways lost with a lot of Blu-ray and 4K.
I agree. I think that Arrow's doing a really good job lately to try to capture that essence of this is how it should look on your shelf. So, especially with their Argento sets right now, and they're giving the classic artwork versions of their boxes and making sure that you get a little booklet so that they can pad it and make it thicker. Oh, yeah. I love that because it gives it that VHS heft, and therefore it kind of takes up more of your visual space and looms a bit on your shelf. Which is what the horror section kind of did to us. You walk in there and they're all just kind of staring at you. Oh, yeah. I miss that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Arrow's limited sort of hard box releases.
Those.
I haven't seen Phantom of the Mall, Eric's Revenge, and I will blind buy it. Because that seems to be a movie that people are sort of scratching their heads at, being why did this get a limited hardbox release? But it's it's that late 80s slasher that's doing a spin-off of Phantom of the Opera. Let's give these movies that, because like you said, I think when you look at someone's shelf and it's these hard boxes, it's the closest that we have at the moment to, maybe aside from German sort of soft shell media books, which I also,
the media books,
which I love, because I mean, if we look at older releases of Blu-rays, you have the digibooks, because I think I have the Clockwork Orange one. I had An Affair to Remember, Little Shop of Horror. I love those releases as much as they might take up more space. But I'm a kid from the 90s. I still have VHS. It takes up more room. But, the things you love in life, it takes up a lot of room. And I'm okay with that.
I mean, we had the shittiest screen ever on a Game Boy, and it took up more space than the Switch. So we're used to things taking up space and it being kind of not our favorite thing. Yeah. But it's there and we love it.
I grew up with a Game Gear, and that thing came with a huge zip-up pouch. And
it's a chonker.
It's a chonker, yeah.
So you were talking before about this kind of rebel spirit for these kind of video nasties and the more schlocky kind of horror films. And I think that's a great kind of segue into what we're going to talk about today, because that spirit, I mean, would you call that spirit maybe a little rock and roll, a little metal?
Definitely a little, I guess, faux black metal. Because I think that's
right.
what this movie sort of taps into. It's not trying to be Norwegian.
No, it's very American. So what movie is it that we're talking about today, Greg?
A little movie from 2012 called The Lords of Salem.
The Lords of Salem. One of the two Rob Zombie movies I was expecting and hoping somebody would bring up for beauty on this podcast, because not enough credit is given to Rob Zombie in his use of his aesthetics in his films. Mm-hmm. The other one would be House of a Thousand Corpses, because I feel like that's where he was just like, can I turn a music video into a movie? Yep. And then I think he did a better job of doing that in The Lords of Salem. So before we get into it, though, I'm going to give a brief synopsis that I've just grabbed from IMDb to make it super brief. I like to see if their synopsis kind of holds up to our discussions here by the end of it. Mm-hmm. So if you haven't seen Lords of Salem, here is what it is about. It says here, Heidi, a radio DJ, is sent a box containing a record, a quote-unquote gift from the Lords. The sounds within the grooves trigger flashbacks of her town's violent past. Is Heidi going mad? Or are the Lords back to take revenge on Salem, Massachusetts? I would say narratively that is very accurate. What they're failing to even touch upon, though, is something I guess a synopsis of this type would never be able to touch upon, and that is the vibe and the mood of this film. I think that's where the strength of it comes into play. So I approached you to be on this podcast, and I asked you to pick a film regarding beauty. You very quickly responded to me with The Lords of Salem. So I really am curious, what drove you to pick this one?
I mean, I think there's like many reasons. I think one of them is it's a film it's not really regarded well by most mainstream audiences, especially most mainstream critics. I mean, if you look at Letterboxd, it's got a 2.9, which isn't...
What?
Yeah, which like I think in the grand scheme of things, I think this used to be a lot lower. And I think just like Jennifer's Body used to have like a 2.6, 2.7, it now rightfully has a 3.5. This, still has a 2.9, but if you look at sort of like the metrics, if you look at like how many 5 stars versus how many 1 stars, it's kind of divisive. It's sort of all over the place, and that's just like Southland Tales. That's sort of the barometer I look at, is not necessarily what rating it has. It's how many people are divided, and this has a lot of people that I sort of interact with, a lot of people I don't, but that I respect, give this 4s, 5s, and even like, some hard 3s with hearts. I will totally appreciate and take. It's the people who sort of slam it as, just Rob Zombie fodder that has it. It's shallow. There's no sort of subtext to it, and that I wholeheartedly disagree with. And I picked I picked it for that reason. I picked it because it's also sort of a late watch for me. I remember when it came out in 2012, I was sort of over Rob Zombie after watching the theatrical cut of Halloween 2.
Right.
And I didn't try again to give Rob Zombie a chance until 31 was released, and I caught it in theater. I caught it in theaters, and I hated it. And I think I might have brought some baggage to that screening. I did pick up 31 recently because it got sort of a steelbook released, and it was on the cheap. And I don't know, Rob Zombie's that type where I'll own anything Rob Zombie does. It doesn't matter.
I get that.
It doesn't matter if I like it or not. I appreciate what Rob Zombie's going for, and I held off on watching Lords of Salem for I probably didn't catch it until 2018, 2017.
Okay.
And I loved it. There was just so much more to it than anyone gave it credit for. And I think the same can be said about the unrated director's cut of Halloween 2, which is a phenomenal film. And, it's, to me, right up there alongside Fire Walk with Me as just being something that it's just... Well, I'm not...
I love that.
To be fair, I'm not the first person that has made that claim. Willow on Twitter was the first person I saw make that, and then I,
Right.
eventually watched Firewalk with Me for the first time, and it was, to me it was clear as day. And there was both sort of incendiary portraits of just trauma and grief, which I think, now in this sort of climate within horror, we're a bit oversaturated with that as sort of text rather than subtext. But I think that, Halloween 2 coming out in 2009, it was something that audiences weren't, and I know the theatrical cut got butchered by the Weinsteins, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I just think audiences weren't really ready for that. Like if it came out now in the cut that, Zombie intended, it'd be right up there alongside, Midsommar and Hereditary, because Scout Compton's performance as that is amazing. You have Brad Dourif. It's just a beautifully shot film, which the cinematographer Brandon Trost, who did Lords of Salem, also shot. But yeah, no, it was a later zombie film that I discovered, but also I think it's also that film come October, Heather Wixon will champion it. Just people start to tweet about it, and it gets a lot of traction. And I think it gains followers or appreciators every year, and rightfully so. I think it's a movie that it does have Rob Zombie's abrasive music video sort of sentiments, but it's also just a lot. It's just very rich and grounded, and it taps into addiction, and it's a quieter film than I think people give it credit for. And I wanted to shine some sort of light on its beauty, because it's one of those films that it could be sort of vile, it could be sort of abrupt and sudden, but it could also just be, I don't know if majestic's the right word, but I just love the look of this movie, and I think that there's beauty in its horror. And I think the sole purpose, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the sole purpose of your podcast is to sort of look at beauty in all its forms. And
yes,
a lot of times with horror that gets sort of sidelined because there's gore, or because it's abrasive, or the imagery is just sort of uncouth, I guess. But this movie, to me, defines horror beauty, or beauty in horror. And yeah, I don't know, I guess I wanted to talk about it because it is my favorite Rob Zombie film, next to Three from Hell and House of a Thousand Corpses. House of a Thousand Corpses it's a lot, I think there's,
it can be, yeah.
And I mean, even when it's being sort of tamer, it's still on a dialogue front, it's a lot more in your face. I mean, the characters played by Chris Hardwick and Rainn Wilson aren't really likable. You end up rooting for the women who are sort of thrown to the wolves. But yeah, here, Heidi, played by Sherry Moon Zombie, she's just a really, really great character. I think that she pulls in maybe her best performance. And I think what I love about her as an actor is that we see her grow. I think House of a Thousand Corpses, she gets a bit unfairly maligned in that movie, but her acting chops really get honed. And I think in Lords of Salem, there's just something that she really brings to that role that very few people, I think, are willing to tap into. And then you also have Jeff Daniel Phillips, who's probably one of my favorite regulars in a zombie film. And then, horror regulars, Ken Voorhees and Dee Wallace, Judy Geeson and Meg Foster. It's just a really incredible film. But I think as somebody who has dealt with addiction, it's sort of, I think it's a lot more, it's a lot deeper than people want to give the film credit for.
I have to strongly agree in this, and I was very excited when you brought the film up. And this latest viewing for me as well, it's one of those movies that I did see more or less when it came out, and I fell in love with it. I remember being obsessed with it before it came out because of some of the imagery. I was just like, is this the same? Are you shitting me? Is this really the same director?
Yeah.
And just because the subject matter alone, you're right. To compare it to stuff like Hereditary, Midsommar, the A24 kind of titles, although it has that Rob Zombie-ishness to it, it, in essence, in a narrative, mirror these things very strongly, and we didn't even know what to do with it at the time. And it wasn't until I watched it again recently, there's been some time between then and now, since the last time I saw it. And the story about addiction became a lot clearer to me this time around, since I've gotten over the just overwhelming sense of dread that you get the first time you watch it, and just kind of try to make sense of some of these things. And obviously I understand aesthetics a little bit more than I did at the time too. So reading a lot of the symbolism in there and the way Zombie has crafted the images in the film become a lot clearer to me as well. It's not as if like you're reading symbols and knowing archaic meanings and you're part of the occult or something. I think a lot of people like to look for codes in movies like this.
Oh, yeah.
When I think it's more just an aesthetic experience that's being created that tells you the emotional core of what's happening. And that's where we can see the complexities of Heidi and the also the rage from this cult and coven of witches. So been championing it for years. I've never understood why it was maligned, other than the fact that it was the art house Rob Zombie movie, and therefore it just wasn't allowed to be good in a lot of people's eyes, because it just felt like, well, Rob Zombie's doing a thing he's not allowed to do. It's kind of how people treated it.
Yeah,
which is really weird to me.
Yeah, I think, like, you make a good point. I think being allowed is sort of, like, a phrase you can use a lot for Rob Zombie. Like, I think his films allow him to do this, but audiences don't, like, sort of hinder him. They don't really allow him to do what he does. And then if you look at the horror genre, it's like me personally, I want more Rob Zombies. I want that sort of unique sort of vehicle for people. And I think House of a Thousand Corpses was that. And I think that all his films look really great. And I think if you look at stills from them, they're going to draw me in. I think the reason that Lords of Salem didn't when it came out in 2012 was not necessarily the imagery or the cinematography. I think it was the editing that I was like, it's going to be abrasive. It's going to be a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm up for it, whoever edited the three people edited House of a Thousand Corpses, and watching it,
it shows.
It definitely shows. And I mean, going back, I watched it this past October again. I love how it feels very much like a music video. But you need to be in the right headspace for it.
Yeah.
And if you're not,
very manic.
Very manic. And if you're, dealing with anxiety or any sort of stress, it's not necessarily cathartic. I feel like it sort of shakes you up. It's like dropping a Mentos in soda. And
oh God, yeah.
But like the editor for most of Rob Zombie's films afterwards was Glenn Garland, and I think it just shifts totally and tonally. And I think you could see that. And with Lord of Salem, it's just a lot more deft hands behind the camera, but you're still not losing the sort of touch that Rob Zombie brings, because there are definitely moments in it that feel cut from his sort of rock sensibilities. And but I don't really want Rob Zombie to lose that. And it's weird that Glenn Garland, who also did Planet Terror, also did 31, which I think is probably Rob Zombie's most manic film next to House of a Thousand Corpses. And I think that's why I didn't appreciate it when I watched it. And I'm hoping, in a future rewatch, I'll turn around on it, because it's the same thing with George Romero. I hope Rob Zombie gets funding for movies. I hope more come from his sort of certain building blocks of making films, because I don't know, you can sort of get into a rut of horror just being churned out, and and not to slander Blumhouse, because I think what Jason Blum is doing is great, but some of the stuff being put out there just feels like a conveyor belt was built specifically for the horror genre. And I'm always happy for people to be getting opportunities, but when it comes to things that stick, Rob Zombie's work is one of those. So I'm always championing his style.
I think a good comparison is actually something I saw on a video from Chris Stuckman. Do you know him?
No.
So he's a YouTube film reviewer and analyst. He also is a film director working on some fledgling projects at the moment. And so he's built a bit of, a little empire for himself as a reviewer and, just cinema in general. But what I love about his work is he also takes the time to create videos where he talks a lot about industry issues, giving perspective on, things are different. For instance, one issue he wants to bring up soon is how, we say movies aren't made the way they used to be anymore. And a lot of the time when people say that, and I've been guilty of this as well, we kind of are insinuating that there's a political shift somewhere, so that ideologically movies are not being made the way they used to be, and something's being taken away. When he's like, I can tell you it is far more boring than that, and it really just comes down to the way, how studios are built and who owns what and all that kind of stuff. And he gave a good example. Now, this is more in the comic book superhero world, but he was talking about how, does he ever change his opinion on movies? And one that he's learned to love a little bit more, even though he doesn't like the things that he didn't like about it, if there are fundamental flaws, he acknowledges them. He's just warmed up to the film, is Spider-Man 3. Because like it, love it, hate it, whatever, you cannot deny that it was Sam Raimi taking a swing and doing something wildly different from the first two movies and giving us what we kind of knew and loved from a director like Sam Raimi, which is just this untapped creative energy. And he didn't make a movie for us. He made a movie for himself. And you don't see that anymore because all of your comic book movies come from Marvel. It's not to say that Marvel Entertainment, for their faults, of course, they make plenty of movies that are just missable, but they also make plenty that are still effective. And on a story building world and universe building side of things, they're doing a pretty interesting and great job. The same way I would say Blumhouse is doing with churning out and getting eyes on a niche genre. But with mainstream appeal comes a lack of variation in how you can do these things, because that's risky. If you're trying to get mainstream eyes on things, you kind of want to make it generally palatable. Dimension were known for doing that a lot during the late 90s. If it didn't look like Scream, they probably weren't going to produce it there for a little while. Yeah. And I think that there's a place for that, and it's great. So yeah, I agree with you. It's not to knock Blumhouse, but it doesn't mean that it's any less incredible and magical to watch a director like Rob Zombie just go, but this is my movie. Whether you love it or not, I made it, and nobody told me what to do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's definitely a similarity between what Zombie's doing and Blumhouse. Not aesthetically or tonally, but it's Blumhouse is producing films sort of not on a dime, but for the cheap, and they're coming out pretty frequently. Rob Zombie, House of 1,000 Corpses, it cost $7 million to make, and I think that, can you see it in that? There's a high production. There's not a high production value, but there's a lot of just product in it, I guess. Yeah,
sets, the cast alone. I think a lot of that money went to them.
Yeah, the house, everything that's in the house. I mean, sure, you can look back at Tobe Hooper and be like, well, you can fill an abandoned house with, animal carcasses and bones and make it look very disgusting. But there is a sheen to TCM that House of 1,000 Corpses sort of wants to mirror, but it's doing it with a lot more neon. It's doing it with a lot more. Yeah, I mean, the feel of the films are similar, but also vastly different. And I think that you can see that in the money that they're putting into it. But Lords of Salem was made for $1.5 million, and
incredible.
And I love that. You have Rob Zombie not trying to go bigger. And you have Rob Zombie making a movie called 31, and it's called that because he finished it in 31 days.
Yeah.
But, you also have Lords of Salem, which was shot in 23 days. And it's just to me, it doesn't matter necessarily what you're striving to do. It ultimately is, how you're doing it. And I think that Rob Zombie is sort of a cut above the rest when it comes to making things on the dime and making things on the fly. And, God bless Blumhouse. I hope, I've loved a lot of the movies that they've made and produced, but there seems to be less of a hands-on a passion behind them, and it seems like it's like when I wake up and I have no time to do anything and I'm just eating plain oatmeal. Not to make that as an insult, but a lot of the films that Blumhouse is doing kind of taste like oatmeal. And I like that Rob Zombie he's got a flavor, if I'm going to go to the
exactly,
route, I'll say he has just, he's got a DNA to it, and I hope he never loses it. And I think that's why House of 1,000 Corpses is so unique. But if we're going to look at a film as a whole, I think The Lords of Salem is his masterpiece.
I have to agree with that. This movie wowed the hell out of me the first time I saw it. I still find it a very impressive thing to watch. And so what I touched upon just in the kind of brief introduction of it is, unlike any other movie that he's created, with the exception of, as you said, maybe if Halloween 2, so more like the H2 director's cut, this movie is far more about vibe and feeling. There's a very simple narrative to it at its core. There is a very simple structure to how it is presented to you. And in that, we explore Heidi's emotional state and her kind of spiritual awakening in music and visuals and all kinds of other things. So aesthetics are used very strongly in this film to really show the language of cinema as a means to tell the story, really. And it all comes back to what we were talking about when we first started this discussion, that Rob Zombie being from this metal world and making his own music videos and stuff. You got the energy of his music and the videos in House of 1,000 Corpses, but you kind of got what he's going for with his visuals more in Lords of Salem, because the visuals and the sound make the vibe, right? Yeah. So it's not the same vibe. I guess that's the reason why it's so manic for House of 1,000 Corpses. He was trying to recreate the vibe of his music, but this would be the first time it's really like, I'm going to take the same kind of approach with a completely different vibe in mind, and therefore telling a completely different emotional core. And it works so well for me. So let's get into the details a little bit then here. So yeah, we have Heidi. We have the fact that she indeed receives this record while interviewing somebody. I think it's during the interview, or right before they start on the radio show. They get this box, and they're like, "We're going to play it on air." And it's just the strangest, like, nasty noise, but it seems to have an effect on the women of Salem, especially those of a particular bloodline. So we already know that something's really messed up about this music, and I love that we get our entryway through music. I'm a big fan of that in aesthetics. I think it's just like how aesthetics are not talked about often enough. Music in aesthetics is kind of pushed to the side. So lovely, bold choice of Zombie to go straight into it. Like, music's my base, so music is where the catalyst to all of this crap comes from. Yeah. And I mean, I do love that it's sort of a genre that isn't necessarily part of his au revoir. It's just like black metal, and it could come off sort of flippant to the genre. Someone as Rob Zombie sort of tackling that, especially when you have, I think, even there's a scene in the radio station where there's a man in corpse paint sort of promoting his work, and the disc jockeys are sort of mocking and laughing, and it could feel like Zombie himself is poking at that sort of genre, but this is a very, it's a film dealing with very serious subject matters, and the catalyst is this sort of discordant metal record that, it comes in a unassuming wooden crate. There's just a symbol on it. But I think it's interesting to tackle this, and I think it could have ended up feeling like a mockery, but there's something just very surreal, but at the same time grounded about the subject and the tone that is established through the music. Because other than that, I mean, you've got Rush. There's a Rush song in there. It feels like an odd love letter. It does to music. It felt very celebratory to me. You're right. It does poke fun, but I do feel that any fan of anything in your genres and stuff should also be able to, kind of laugh at yourselves. So there are aspects of it that, are a little funny and silly to people who are like, zombies the kind of guys like, hey, I pretend to be a damn zombie. It's in my name.
Yeah.
And yet I still think it's kind of funny that you all put on the same face paint and then act like you're denizens of Satan. And it's like, but on one hand, it's like rock and roll, motherfucker. On the other hand, it's like, you do know what you're doing, right? You are a child at Halloween. You're not even like and it's funny. I also love that you can poke fun of that because to me it felt the same as if you watch something like Fright Night and they watch older horror films. Are we making fun of it when we are making fun of Brewster, or are we acknowledging the fact that sometimes we can be a little nerdy when we're talking about our favorite horror movies, and some of them are kind of difficult to sit through sometimes if you really want to get I guess a little over snarky about the whole thing.
Yeah, I think what I love about Lords of Salem is that there's like a richness and a history to the story, and that I don't think that they're necessarily. I mean, there's definitely a scene between the scholar. He goes to sort of find out information about the band Lords of Salem and sort of the coven of witches that used to exist within Salem, and that's a scene I think specifically to drive exposition, but. Save for that 6 minutes, a lot of the exposition is through sort of tone and sort of like this sonic resonance that sort of happens through the music. Because I think that you look at the Coven of Witches and the, makeshift instruments that they're playing and the chanting and sort of like it creates sort of like a cacophony, which ends up being on the vinyl that Heidi receives in the wooden crate. But it sort of, to me, is linked to the way classic rock from the 70s sort of plays into other genres of the 80s and the 90s. And I mean, they're all sort of linked through, this need to create this sonic spell. And I think that's one of the reasons why this works, is because it never sort of strays away from the rhythm that it creates. Like, it may, the record itself creates, a headache in Heidi, and she can't really listen to it. And the thing that it does to the women of Salem is, it drives them into a sort of a catatonic state. But it's all about the music. And I think that, and how that plays into our weaknesses and, and even the imagery of sort of torture devices. Like it's used to represent what, what happened to these women who, were believed to be witches. And in this story, were actually witches, but they loom over Heidi as if it's sort of this addiction that she can't get away from, because we get quiet moments of her walking the streets of Salem, or at sort of a group meeting at the basement of a church. Like, it's just, you get sort of these little moments that sort of really tap into the sadness of it all. But ultimately, it's about this record. And, you could say it's about these witches and it's about history, but ultimately so is this album. I mean, it's sort of, it almost is treated as if this lineage of music that means something to Rob Zombie, and then ultimately it means something to us.
Yeah, and I think that's what hits me so hard in the film, is how there is a lot being explored throughout it in the background that is both text and subtext. And it's, in a way, kind of Zombie communicating to his audience. So, he comes from the perspective of being a musician. He has one of his band members do a lot of the music in it. So, John Five, being this, godlike figure with a guitar, knows a lot about the history of rock and different guitars and, just the practical application of things. So, great person to apply a lot of these different styles to it and still make it sound weird, because it's still John Five and his unique stylings, with Rob Zombie's sensibilities, because they collaborated already on albums. On top of that, I'm sure there's always been a part of the music and the imagery and stuff that people just didn't get. So there's always been this counterculture kind of protest to the music and to the imagery. There's always been this kind of pushback against conservative conformity, things like that. And it's just not shoved down your throat. It's done with fun. Let's also celebrate old Halloween and celebrate this carny aspect of horror where we, the old fun houses and stuff. And I love that he's always mixed those together, but, that one aesthetic and vibe, that party vibe seems to have been the one that took over. So then when he brings in all of his slasher movies with this really mean-spirited kind of anti-government counterculture energy to them, people still only pick up on the fact that it's basically clowns who are cussing up a storm and being rednecks and killing people. And so when you get this movie, it really felt to me for the first time like he was like, look, there's a reason why I choose to emulate movies like Black Sunday and these classic like satanic films, because they are, for one, they were kind of like swept under the rug by a lot of people. Somehow they didn't kind of hit the mainstream and scare people the way unrelated shit was labeled satanic. And these movies were more blatantly like, hey, this is female empowerment. This is the empowerment of women, and linking back to what old pagan rites that were being kind of taken down by a lot of fundamentalist Christian views were doing, which is a very strong topic within Salem. It's a great setting for the story. Oh, yeah. And you get to tell that story, but also show like, but dude, that's why I do the music that I do and have the imagery that I do. Just because it's really hunky-dory, funny, funkadelic, rockabilly stuff doesn't mean that it lacks any substance to it. Sometimes it doesn't have it because that's not what I'm making. Same with his movies. Every single movie, it's like, which one are you in the mood for? It's always going to be a Rob Zombie movie, but there's usually something else in there if you want to pay attention to it. And also to question yourself. I mean, like I said, there's a lot of counterculture stuff in House of a Thousand Corpses. It comes from Otis, though. So it's not like you really have to say, like, do I agree with the guy who's wearing this girl's father as a skin suit? Yeah. And is torturing people because, frankly, he has no morals. So I like that he challenges you that way, and you get those challenges in this film as well because, frankly speaking, with the Coven, you're right, they are witches, they are satanic, they are everything that people claim them to be. And then when you hear why, and there are things that they're kind of fighting against, I'm like, I mean, you're not wrong. Oh, yeah. So you are oppressed as hell, and you do have a lot of Puritan hatred around you, and you are just practicing a religion that, yeah, it is the counter to the other thing. So you do get that dichotomy, but at the same time, applying this real world history to this fantastical belief the way a lot of people really believe witches were, I think is such a big power play for a film to make, because you get both, and now you have to decide, like, okay, they're evil now. Are they still wrong? Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I think the thing I love is it's almost like the power of the female form, sort of as moved by music, because it's it's a song created by this coven of witches, and it ends up being sort of immortalized on record, and it ends up stirring something not great in Heidi. She ends up falling back on, old addictive habits, and her sort of life ends up falling apart. But almost at the end, she's sort of lifted up as this sort of like new being. And I think, I think there's a sort of a similarity to the way people champion the end of Midsommar, which I don't fully, sort of, I guess, abide by. But here, you could argue the same thing. But yeah, like, I mean, I think just through Rob Zombie's use of All Tomorrow's Parties, even Mozart's Requiem, like, there's just this sort of love letter to sort of like that, what artists, whether it's Velvet Underground or Mozart, like what they were doing at that time, clashing against sort of the norm. Because I mean, I can't imagine Mozart's Requiem was taken well by people. It's just it's metal for its time, and it really was. And even Velvet Underground and Nico is like, it's sort of metal in its own way. It's very hard edged, and that's sort of what I love about the use of this old song, which was performed by John Five and Griffin Boyce, who did a lot of most of the music on the soundtrack, but even the mock
black metal song used in the movie called Crushing the Ritual. It's, the band in the movie is Leviathan the Fleeing Serpent, and it's performed by, Rob Zombie and John Five, but it's like an almost 4-minute song, and they actually, committed to it. And I think that watching Lords of Salem, you could just tell how committed Zombie is to fleshing out all these details and all these characters.
Absolutely. And to a point that you're making, I do want to make it clear, like when I say whether they were right or wrong, they are wrong in their actions, of course, because they are abusing somebody to their goals.
Yes.
It's just like where the rage comes from is what I'm kind of saying. Like, I don't find that is incorrect. Like, yeah, of course, I don't blame you for being pissed off is basically what I'm getting at there. And also by the mere fact that we've created this sort of almost comic book dichotomy of good and evil. We also have an interesting way of them criticizing real world indoctrination and religion, because you see how in this coven that is supposedly fighting against oppression still does a lot of the same mental tactics and abuses that a lot of religious organizations do in the real world. So whether your cause ultimately is good, say how a lot of messages are to treat people with equality because we are all under the same creation, we still have plenty of individual institutes and organizations that are dedicated to preying on your weaknesses and basically breaking you down so that you kind of just go with it, and then you either believe it or at least you're just going with it because you've decided to do so, which is, they kind of force Heidi. There's this whole question of consent in this film that is very uncomfortable throughout the whole film, but I love that about it because it murks up the whole topic and conversation about, witches versus whatever systems and stuff, because in that sense, nobody's right. It's really like, why couldn't Heidi just be herself and do her own thing? That would have been the only correct thing, right?
Yeah.
And so there's the horror in there beyond just the very stereotypical blood and hell and demons and witchcraft. I think there's that human horror element to it where that's the heart of the film. And seeing her relationship with her friends and her coworkers, how they're checking up on her and stuff. I love that they explored that through this, because it makes the film grounded when it goes way off the rails thematically in a lot of levels. But it never really feels like it does, because we do have believable, grounded characters with real problems.
Yeah, and sort of a grounded, real setting that juxtaposes with, this fire and brimstone Salem setting of, where the color palette changes completely.
Yeah.
You go from these sort of dimly lit halls where this like peeling sort of floral wallpaper is, and it's a very gray, subdued tone versus the incendiary setting that is Salem of old. And I think the beauty in Heidi's character is that, she's mid to late 30s, let's say, and she's a woman living on her own in Salem by herself. Like, there is no role beget upon her of you'd be a mother or working on this relationship. And that's why I really love her dynamic with Jeff Daniel Phillips' Herman character, because it feels like this real friendship that's just, there's no sort of clear direction. Nothing's put upon them. They just sort of exist. And I think that it gives Heidi, especially when she starts toying with sort of the darker side of this and sort of grappling with her addiction. I mean, all the three witches played by Dee Wallace, Patricia Quinn, at least the modern ones.
Right. The Descendants.
Yeah. And Judy Geeson, who's Lacey Doyle, who's, I believe, is the landlady. They want her to bear a child, and for them, this woman is the perfect vessel, because she seems untethered to things. She's got this frailty, this sort of fragility that is very real, and that to me is sort of what taps into what I love about the film. But Yeah, there's something very strong about Heidi's character, and it doesn't matter if she falters and, you know, sort of like the wallpaper outside her apartment door, it just sort of starts peeling. She's
Right.
a very strong character, and I think that there's a strength in her weaknesses because they're just something that, I mean, even at the end of the film when she's drugged, and you can't really, it sort of ends up becoming unclear whether it's the drugs that she's fallen back on or it's the witches themselves sort of digging deeper into her psyche. But you know, she's on her way to go see this performance with her two coworkers, and she says, "I'll get there on my own." And I think it's just like a really empowering statement, even if it's carrying with it a lot of sadness, because this is a woman who very clearly gets there on her own. I mean, she, you know, kicked the habit the first time. And I ended up reading the novelization of this a couple of years ago because I kind of stumbled upon it at this bookstore in Philadelphia. I had no idea there was a novelization of it. And it's not the most well-written book, but I loved it. Did tap into sort of the dynamic and the characters and like the richness of the history a lot more because this is the type of movie where I'm watching it and I'm like, you know, I'm okay if you're longer. I think this is like the sort of world that I love living in. And I mean, just like looking at it, it's, you know, they shot 3 days exterior in Salem. Most of it was shot in LA, I think in the same studio where they shot Saw. But it's a film that transports you. And I think originally they wanted it to take place in the 70s, but budgetary constraints, they just sort of gave it a 70s look with it, which I think, you know, Brandon Trost did, you know, really well at doing. Because you look at this and you're like, this is a film shot on digital, but it has a 35 millimeter grain to it. Like
it really does.
Like there's a texture to it. And I think that it sort of gives Heidi and the things that are manifesting around her, it gives it sort of this life. And yeah, I think the one thing that I really want to sort of point out is that like the female form is very much on display here. You have the Coven of Witches sort of like shedding their tattered robes to reveal their, you know, naked bodies. And, you know, some of them are older. There's just various body shapes, ages, and there's like such a beauty to that. And I think the thing that, and not to bring up, you know, another Ari Aster film, but the ending of Hereditary, I guess it didn't really sit, a small aspect of it that didn't sit well with me was that it felt like it was using naked old people to sort of make you uneasy.
Fair, yeah.
You know, and I think with this is that it doesn't really fall prey to that because I think that it's unsettling in context, but not the content. Like the opening where they're naked and it's showing their bodies, but it doesn't linger on it. It doesn't feel gratuitous. And I think that it feels sort of empowering.
Yeah.
And, you know, and a lot of the frames are, you know, when Meg Foster's sort of naked in the hallway, like it shows her body, I think, to primarily show what was happened to her, the hardships that you know, occurred, but also just age and history. And I think that it's not doing so in sort of a frightening, in-your-face way, because there are quote-unquote jump scares in this. I think a lot of the tracking shots in the apartment where Meg Foster's in a room or up in the corner, or there's like a torture device swaying, but nothing sort of is thrown in your face. And a lot of it's close-ups of, you know, her face. And I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of care to the naked form in this, and I think that there's a lot of beauty in it.
And to your point, the way that it is expressed does have a very strong, empowering feeling to it. It is perhaps what some would call grotesque or just a little jarring, because we're used to seeing almost fetishized image of the female form. Mm-hmm. So if nudity is used to make somebody uncomfortable, yeah, I agree with you that it seems to me as well that Hereditary is just kind of like, isn't this creepy? They're all naked and they're a bit older. And I guess for that film as well, they're all kind of like waspy middle class and upper class people. So it's even creepier. Same idea that you get with Rosemary's Baby. It's the elite who are doing all that sort of stuff, but it's to make them feel kind of like they're wacky and off kilter.
Yeah.
But in this movie, it really felt like they were rebellious and showing who they are, and you weren't going to stop them. So part of their celebration of each other and their femininity comes with them glorifying their bodies, regardless of shape, regardless of age. So, and regardless of basically like how much in one piece you are, because as you were saying, a lot of them have been abused and literally wear the scars of what they've had to go through just for being themselves, for being women, for being witches, for daring to go against the grain. And of course, it feeds their rage, and it does turn them into monsters on an ideological level, but it is a very empowering image, because this movie at no point really felt to me like it was trying to unsettle anybody except for the people who kind of needed to be. So it's like, oh, does this make you uncomfortable? Maybe it should, because you need to wake up just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing more, I think, sort of raw and empowering than embracing the naked form and sort of shedding your skin, and just watching them sort of do that amidst this fire and chanting. I think within the context of the story, it's supposed to be unsettling because, yes, these are witches who are eventually going to prey on 21st century woman, but at the same time, this is a liberating scene where they're, tapping into this primal sort of core, and ultimately for that, like, they're punished and they're branded, yes, they're burned, and yeah, I think sort of as like a swaying pendulum of history, you get these torture devices sort of within the deep shadows of Heidi's apartment and her kitchen, and they're there not only, I think, to sort of loom as a cautionary tale on how addiction is always sort of ever present, but also as a woman, it's this history. It's sort of just, it's like a vice. It just sort of it's will always be holding you and should never be sort of forgotten. And would this be a lot more of a direct or maybe a sturdier message if it was written and directed by a woman? I don't know. I think Rob Zombie, and I think this sort of taps into the sexism that a lot of people go through when it's like, well, Rob Zombie cast Sherry Moon Zombie in another role, and it's like, well, why does he keep casting his wife? And it's just like, well, I think that there's a lot more creative sort of back and forth this way, and I think that there is an appreciation for the female form, for women, that we would like to give credit to a male director for, and I think that it sort of shows, and you could feel it. It's like Firewalk with Me, I think, is great in that way. And would I ever want anyone other than Lynch to do it just because of his gender? No, I don't. I think it's saying a lot without necessarily being overt. And yeah, I think that the collaboration that these two have speaks more than just, I'm casting my wife in these movies. Exactly.
I think there's also a big fallacy in not just the general scope of a man can't tell these stories because a man wouldn't know what it's like, but what you're doing in that is you're, in a way, you're committing the same level of sexism and misogyny because you are omitting the women involved in the production in having a say in this. You're assuming that Rob Zombie is just the singular person who's saying, well, this is what it is. But like you're saying, I think it's a definite collaboration between him and his wife. And there's also this exploration of them saying, like, there's nothing wrong in feeling sexy and really celebrating your body and celebrating your sex drive and just having fun and living life and showing it off, regardless of how you look, which they do in this movie. It's so wonderful because of all the different body types. There are so many people who have powerful moments who don't have her body, who don't have the same physique. And, for one, he loves his wife. He finds her hot. That part is there, of course. I think part of that, when people feel that way, is just because it's like they like Rob Zombie's directorial style. They don't necessarily like her. I also wonder if there's sometimes just a little bit of jealousy there. Just absolutely. Because it's a very wholesome relationship that they have with each other, and they happen to both be very aesthetically pleasing people. So sometimes we want to vilify that just for the sake of it, but I'm like, I don't get the same kind of frat boy energy I do with a lot of these power couples. I really feel that they're just doing their own thing, and sometimes it rubs people the wrong way because they're successful at it. And they're not doing it for you. They're doing it for themselves.
Yeah, no. And I do think Rob Zombie sort of tongue-in-cheek pokes at that, because there's this, like, I mean, the first shot you have of Sherry Moon Zombie, she's naked in bed with her ass up. And then later on in the movie, she's wearing boxers, laying down, like sleeping. And somehow, unbeknownst to anyone, they got pulled down to the point where her butt's exposed. And I know. Like, you know, you're like, how? How did that happen? She was sleeping.
And what I love the most about it is he proves a really good point. I don't care how quote-unquote hot you are. There is just something just kind of pathetic about watching somebody sit around with their ass hanging out. Like, they don't even have the wherewithal to, like, pull their pants up. They don't care. Yeah. She's in such a low state due to her addictions and her depression and all the weight of the world being on her that she doesn't understand because nobody's explained anything to her. I think it's such a great image because, yes, there's the humor of it because Rob Zombie does have that wonderful dark sense of humor, and I think Sherry shares the same thing. Hell, she could have thought of it like, I want my ass hanging out, because it just shows that, you know, it's a funny thing to look at, but it's like, it's not appealing. You can have the nicest ass in the world, but if you have like just shitty boxers on and they're kind of hanging off, you just look like you need to take care of yourself a little bit right now. Yeah. And I love that they did that with her because it's not the kind of image you're going to expect from, well, I put my hot wife in my movie and I want her because she's my favorite person. I think she's just the right person for the job. She's doing the job that she has here. And you can tell that they're working together nice and closely because of the trust of doing this, because of the fact that it is unflattering. And it tells the story. She's not supposed to be flattering.
Yeah, it's like you know, is the bare ass or the ass crack, is that, you know, is that associated with plumbing or that sort of blue collar, you know, work, or is the blue collar work associated with the ass crack? And here it's like, I think that Rob Zombie's like, okay, well, she's in a state of disarray and is sort of a degenerate state that she's, you know, her ass is out. It's not like, yes, it happens to be a very beautiful ass, but it's within context, it adds to sort of the emotionality of it being, okay, she's not in a good place.
Exactly.
And, you know, but I also think that, you know, at this point, it's just like, okay, I'm Rob Zombie. And yeah, I know that, you know, I like my wife's ass. So here you go.
So if you want to be mad about that, I've put it in there for you to be mad about and get distracted and not pay attention to my fucking movie. Yeah. Because if you're paying attention to the movie, you should feel really sad right now. I mean, how many, any of us who've ever had a severe illness and fever, you know what it's like, or even just, I'd say just, even a depression, you know, a mental health issue, no matter what, something that can incapacitate you from within, you know what it's like to just hang around on the bed and just look at something and be like, I need to fix that. Like, just your arm being in the wrong position, you're like, it's starting to hurt, but I don't have the energy or the willpower to do it.
Yeah, and I feel like it's rough, you know, and it being her ass that's exposed while she's sleeping, it sort of taps into this idea that Heidi as a character is sort of gone before she knows it. Yeah. And almost as if it's chasing her, and she's just sort of, I don't know, because we first encounter her in the beginning where she's on a bus or being taken to, I believe, the radio station. Like, she just seems to be really, and the book taps into this more, but she's just trying to get through with life and, you know, keep moving forward. And it's like this history that is sort of defines the town of Salem is moving forward well at like a barreling pace to try and, you know, overcome her. And, you know, ultimately it does.
Yeah. Thematically and literally in the case of this film. And I just love that you're pointing out that, though, that this is how aesthetics work. In fact, I want to come to that quote then. I think this is a good time to talk about it because, as saying here, so this is from a scholar by the name of Bence Nanay. He wrote a book that is just kind of an introduction to aesthetics. It's literally called Aesthetics, a very short introduction. It's a very small book, and it's not the shortest of things, but it's very thin, very small. It's easy to read. And so the whole point that he did with this book, well, this is a whole series, a very short introduction of things. And they chose Nanay to do the aesthetics one because of all the different types of awards and books and stuff that he's worked on. And he just gives a more clearly stated account of the complexities of aesthetics, the types of approaches there are, the types of aesthetic experiences there are. And this is a bit earlier on where this quote comes from, where he's just talking about what it means to engage with aesthetics, but also to help clearly steer the reader into understanding the importance of what you should be focusing on. Because it's one thing to note, yes, there are aesthetics in this media, whether it be visual, audible, whatever. Yes, okay, we can acknowledge it, noted, whatever. But like he says here, the big question is how we can explain this kind of aesthetic engagement and the way it is triggered. So it's not enough to just say, I had an aesthetic experience. Well, we don't. Okay, cool. But can we really share this with each other? Is that something that somebody can learn from? Mm-hmm. But if you were to figure out how to convey that in clear language, you create a bit of a universality behind it, even if the details, like your tastes, your sensibilities, if those things change. So for instance, let's say, this is not an aesthetic thing, but say you want to talk about something like fear or love. It's not so much about what we love or what we fear. It's about, I can explain to you the sensation, and I think we would agree on it. The same goes for aesthetic experiences. They are objective in that we can say that something is beautiful. We can say that something is sublime, grotesque, all of the things I'll be talking about this season, because there are specific, just detailed feelings that come with it. Mm-hmm. Again, they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's where we get into the subjective part of it, of what is beautiful and what isn't. I am not so interested in that because I feel that that's just an endless debate back and forth that people like to have. You know, there are people, and I would say a vast majority of people, especially in these fields and philosophy, are more interested in arguing with each other and trying to show who has more knowledge than the other, than really getting to the heart of what it is we're actually trying to talk about. And I feel that this is a great film to apply this sort of lesson to, because it does point out the differences between something that you necessarily like, or to say that, okay, it has aesthetic experiences in it, but to get caught up and say that's all there is to this. And I've heard that argument a lot with The Lords of Salem, because people are basically applying their sensibilities about past works from Rob Zombie where that would totally apply. I think a film like House of a Thousand Corpses, you can more easily say that about, just because it is meant to be a fun horror film. It's a throwback to when a lot of horror films were made just to kind of shock you with what they had. Mm-hmm. Even though, keep in mind, that's what the emulation is doing. As you were pointing out, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, shoestring budget, actually had a point to it, though. It was really talking about the meat industry and the way blue-collar workers were being treated in America post-Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. Well, that's taken out with a lot of the emulation because we were just going for vibe, right? We just want to feel those kind of like, man, remember that feeling you got when you saw the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Well, this movie makes you feel that way, that anxiety, every single time you watch it. So that's a very aesthetically driven film. It's taking the aesthetics of something else and giving you a different core. Lords of Salem, I think, is a film where Rob Zombie is proving that you can do both. You can do the aesthetics part of it and it all be true and be accurate, but that doesn't mean that the aesthetics don't add to the conversation of a deeper story. And so this movie unfairly was maligned as being written off as just an aesthetics feast, but that's just how aesthetics are treated, unfortunately. People look at them as if they're just there, and if you put a lot of aesthetics in your film, you're kind of like, it's kind of like putting a bunch of gravy over your potatoes. You don't really want to taste the potato. You're adding this extra tastier thing to it, or adding sugar to stuff. Yeah. But that's not the case. Aesthetics really inform a lot and say a lot. They're just not inherently linked to anything. It's not as if there can be politics of aesthetics, but it's not as if I can say, oh, this is beautiful, therefore politically it must mean this. It's not that kind of a reading. Doesn't mean that it's not there, though. And I love that we're exploring this film, The Lords of Salem, in a way that is exploring Heidi's addiction, exploring her mental state, depression, oppression within a larger system. And it's all coming from how there's this grimy, grayish kind of vibe. And as you were saying, the film kind of transforms as we go. And I think that's where this empowerment comes from as well. When the neon starts kicking in, all the psychotropic, psychedelic stuff kicks in, you start to question, is it really a drug trip that she's going through? Or is it this transformative thing that they're creating within her? And we're seeing from that perspective. You can do both. It could be hell, it could be whatever. But the point is that the aesthetics actually have a point in the film, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and I mean, I think specifically with Rob Zombie using sort of pop culture and things within the zeitgeist. I mean, she's got George Millet's Trip to the Moon on her bedroom wall.
Yeah.
The films that she's watching a noir from the 40s. I do not know the name of it. But yeah, everything within her, I mean, even at the end when she's sort of ascending to this, higher power almost, she's wearing sort of she's wearing corpse paint. She's wearing a sort of Freddy sweater, but its colors are black and gray, black and white. And yeah.
Kind of a Pugsley thing as well. Oh,
yeah. And I mean, like the hallway of her apartment is, the lights are this sort of headache inducing ultraviolet. And everything is just sort of on blast, but in downtones.
Yeah.
And it's I wouldn't say it's murky, but it's super downtrodden versus where she goes at the end, which is this huge amphitheater. It's beautiful, lots of yellows. It's sort of radiating and it's pulsating. And I think it's an aesthetic choice. And I find it very pleasing. I mean, I find the whole film's look to be pleasing, but I think it sort of, just like TCM, it exemplifies and it sort of symbolizes something greater. And I mean, I'm not a fan of a lot of things that look aesthetically pleasing. I think Zardoz is a movie that looks amazing, but I don't like it. But I will say that aesthetically pleasing nature, it's what's going to draw me back to revisiting it and maybe tapping into it and maybe finding something that sort of speaks to me. And this, luckily from the get-go, it just spoke to me because I think that it's, what it represents and what it's shouting about. I mean, the witch is defying the patriarchy, her sort of falling back into addiction. I think showing the cracks, the beauty is all there. And I mean, it's, little doses of Rob Zombie's sort of rock sentimentality and music video sort of inclinations. It's just creates, I think, a really incredible portrait of things that are very relevant today.
So what you just painted for me with your description here, it really sparked something in me. Because we're talking about beauty, we're talking about I love that you used the word pleasing. So we're using this language that's used often in philosophy as well to describe a beautiful experience. It's considered delightful. It's a pleasing experience. And so we're showing now very clearly, if I may use you as this kind of case study right now, how I think a lot of people would disagree with us about it being pleasing. And that's where I guess taste kind of comes into play. But it is communicative because there are some objectively, I would say universally pleasing, beautiful things in there that are evocative. So you have the use of Mozart. You have this grand opera hall with all the gold and everything. Things that are, we could say they are stereotypical, but they're only stereotypical because they're kind of like, we more or less all agree that shiny gold is kind of nice to look at, right? Mm-hmm. And the sounds of Mozart, he was the pop star of his day for a reason. It was just easy music to listen to, not because it was simple, because it was quite beautiful. It was very well made, especially his more somber stuff like the Requiem. But that is evocative of a more mainstream idea of beauty. And then you have here it being mixed with all the other things that you were talking about. And especially when you get in this rock sensibility that Rob Zombie has. I think a lot of people who push against it, they just don't like it. And that's fine. But admit that. Just say, I don't like that. But please stop trying to diminish the quality of the work without really analyzing, is there more to it than this? And I think people write things off like there can't be more to it than that because I don't like it. Look, people, you're not wrong for disliking something, even if everybody else were to just agree and say, but this is how it is. If you dislike it, that's fine. Your tastes are yours. That's a wonderful thing. Don't let anybody dictate what your tastes should be. So if you don't like Rob Zombie's aesthetics, if you don't like this grungy, rockabilly, carny kind of thing, I get that. That's fine. But what you are saying when you say it's just this or it's just that, it's just a bunch of that kind of shit. Mm-hmm. That's the attitude a lot of people will get with there. You are really diminishing the fact that somebody actually put some creative work into something and may have actually been doing more because you didn't take the time to analyze it, whether you like it or not. Because I agree with you as well, Greg, that there are plenty of beautiful films that most people would agree are, but they do have a kind of style over substance thing that no matter how many times I've tried to see or watch them and get anything out of it, I'm really like, I don't know. I think it's just really nice to look at. And there's parts of it like, and if I want that, I'm going to watch this movie. In the case of Rob Zombie, like turn the I hate the way his movies look and I hate the language in his movies off just a moment. And what you are seeing is him actually saying to us, but I find this stuff genuinely beautiful. He's showing the beauty in all of that. Whether you can experience it yourself or not, I think that we can all agree that the attempt is being made in this film by combining it with Mozart, by combining it with a lot of high art, quote unquote. You can see he is basically saying like, but I think the squalor is beautiful. I love the muck. I love the blue collar. I love the average person who's been beaten and oppressed and torn down because they are beautiful people. I love the angry people. You know, there's a lot of love in this film, even for those who are pretty nasty and abusive in it. I want to get on that in a moment here as well, because I do feel that there is a detail about Heidi that does change a little bit of the Coven's stance as a villainous entity just because of who Heidi actually is. It's just very unfortunate. So before I get into that, I just want to really express how appreciative I am of your analysis and unpacking of this, because I think it's such a great step for a lot of people who may not be used to seeing aesthetics in that way to show like, look, we are talking about a Rob Zombie movie and we're seeing all of these connections just because we kind of understand how filmmakers kind of think when they're making a movie, and you can see where he's taking certain steps and trying to apply certain things just through aesthetics.
Yeah. And I mean, this is a film that I think is, it shifts its focus right from the get-go towards its women. And I mean, it doesn't give any time really towards Reverend Hawthorne, who is, the one perpetrating the crimes against the witches. This is very much their vehicle, ill intent or not. And most of the men in this movie are sort of guided by the women in their lives. I mean, you have... True. Jeff Daniel Phillips is very much... He's got this really complicated relationship with Heidi, but it means a lot to him. And then you also have Bruce Davidson's character, Frances Matthias. I mean, his wife of 26 years, I think, is like someone who means a lot to him, and he looks to her for guidance. And yep. I mean, there's just a beauty about that, and I think that, like. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. In this sort of climate, we have people who think, okay, well, Scorsese really, with a movie like The Irishman being so long, he's doing it again. He's doing the gangster pick again. What more can he say? And it's just like a lot. Like, I mean, there's so much that you can do with that. Just like there's so much that Anna Paquin's character in that movie can do without lines. And I think people do the same thing with Rob Zombie. Rob Zombie is sort of tapping into this abrasiveness and his history with music, and it's just not my thing. It's fine to say, but to say that there's nothing there is just diminishing the work of, I think, so many people. And I mean, it's also just not really giving them a fair shot. Exactly. I think there's a phrase that I love seeing on Twitter all the time that I think more people should embrace, and it's the whole, like, it's just not for me, fam. That's... It's big of you to hold your head high and just say to somebody, I just can't do it.
But that's because it's on you. You know, you're not vibing with what they're putting down. And it's not to say that if you are offended by some things, I don't want to take away that if you just hate the language, if there's a sensibility there that you find a bit off-putting, I get you. I really understand that. However, I do feel there's more in this film than people like to put credit on, because it's easy to look at this and think it's just kind of weird, misogynistic stuff, when actually most of that stuff I found very empowering to see in this film.
Yeah.
And that's just because I gave it the time to really unpack what it was doing. In that, I think, comes from the aesthetics. I really let them drag me in and be like, why is there neon light here? And okay, I get to just like have a very strong anti-Christian, or at the very least like fundamentalist kind of message here. Anti-religion to a certain degree, because even the coven are not shown in a positive light. So there's this kind of tragedy that comes from it when you stop looking at this wild acid trip of a film and start looking at the character that's being affected by the acid trip of the film. But people wanted to write off Sherry Moon as just, well, she's just the wife of. I'm not really going to pay attention to what she's doing in this movie. She's trying to act. I'm like, she's killing it. She's doing a great job in this movie. Yeah. And just pay attention to what the damn story has in it, whether you like the acting or not. That's another thing. All of these things are taste issues. Okay, the acting can be deemed poor if you wish, and you can still have a movie that's trying to tell you something. It doesn't take away what's in there. So what I want to get into real quick is I have mentioned a few times the fact that, yes, Heidi is definitely an unfortunate person who is brought in, abused, and, you know, especially from the perspective of addiction, I really sympathize with that, how, like, hard that must be to see somebody fall into this, and of course how much more evil this coven looks through her falling into it. I will say, though, the interesting bit there that they've added to it to kind of add this dilemma is the fact that she's from the bloodline of the very people that created the situation in the first place. It's kind of like she's the only one there that they can kind of sort of punish in a way, and instead of doing that, they actually, by virtue of being a woman from Salem, she's inducted into their coven and turned into a saint by the end of the film and gives birth to the Antichrist. She becomes the most important person for them because of this strong feminist message in the film, that they take their worst enemy, they break her down because it hurts her ancestors, basically. And that part is really hard to watch and immoral and terrible. It's hard to, argue for it at all. But I do love the fact that there's this element of, it doesn't take away from the feminism in the film. It's still so strong because she becomes basically like the mom of the new Salem.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely strip her of any agency. I mean, at that point,
that's true.
Once they sort of, I guess, no pun intended, open up the vein and sort of get her addicted to drugs again, it's, she loses all sense of herself. She loses her sense of, I guess, what she means to her friends and to her coworkers. But, like, yeah, I don't think that necessarily diminishes the empowerment of it, even if it's ill-intended, I guess. But,
yeah,
that was always one thing I was unsure about this. If the people who listened to the album and were sort of put into a catatonic state, if those were only ancestors of the 6 women, the Coven of Witches, because
I'm curious too.
Because you have, Barbara Crampton plays one of the women, I think, in a bike shop when she's hearing it on the radio, and she becomes catatonic. But then you have Francis's wife, Alice. She, he comes back after promoting his book on the radio show, and he wants to know if she listened to it, and she's like, "Oh, I never miss I would never miss it." And he was like, "Oh, well, did you hear that song that they played?" And she's like, "Yeah, like it was just really bad, like kind of," and it seemed to not have the same effect on her, as if, because she's, and he makes that clear later on in the film that she's sort of an out of towner. She's not, a Salem lifer. So yeah, I was always unsure because I can't remember from the book if it's just the women of Salem or if it's anyone just within this bloodline. Because at the end, when the doors open to the auditorium in the climax, the chairs aren't full of women of Salem. It seems to be pretty scattered, but they don't make it very clear. So I've always kind of been unsure about that, even though I've watched this movie about 6 or 7 times.
Okay. Well, they do say, I mean, I just finished the tail end of it because I realized my last time I tried to watch it, I actually apparently missed the whole ending. I must have gotten called into work or something. So I just finished the ending of it last half hour. And in the credits, they do have some news bits talking about how it turned into a mass suicide in basically, quote unquote, reality.
Yeah.
And there are 32 women that were all from the same bloodline that were there. They're a part of that kind of coven. But, you know, keep in mind, Heidi is from the Hawthorne bloodline. Mm-hmm. And that's what made it interesting for me, was that she's from the bloodline of the Protestants.
The oppressor, yeah.
Yeah, from the oppressor. And so the way they treat her is both like, that's where the evil part comes in. You're punishing her for the sins of her, you know, ancestors, which is just insanely vile.
Yeah.
But then you have the fact that yet she's still, by virtue of being a woman from Salem, ends up being the perfect vessel that they use. But you're right about the whole, like, taking away her agency and stuff. This is where we can get into more critical aspects of the film and where the discomfort comes into play. And they are villains, so it makes sense. You know, so it's not a happy story. I'm not saying...
Yeah, they vilify her.
Yeah, exactly. And as you were saying with, like, Midsommar, I would say that one has more of a gray area than the Lords of Salem. This one's definitely a tragic ending.
Yes.
It just in grand fashion.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. You kind of get caught up into the seduction of this coven and this beautiful imagery that they're using and the grandiose nature that they are. This whole performative aspect of how they do the ritual. I mean, it was meant to be a concert, right? And it never happens. It's just this weird demonstration that they do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's sort of, I mean, I don't know, even the film's use of Requiem, like, it all kind of feels like some grand, tragic opera, you know, where it's just this woman that you are really rooting for has this a sort of immediate tragic imposition or something like imposed on her. And I mean, it builds to it, but when those doors close, it happens very suddenly. She's just sort of, you know, she says her goodbyes and she's sort of whisked away, and then that's it. You don't see the other two, Ken Voorhees and Jeff Daniel Phillips, and it's, yeah, I don't know. There's something very tragic, very operatic about it.
I also feel that, to a point I was making earlier, and I guess it's where I was trying to come from the most about this kind of push-pull I have with these antagonists, is that we see the violence, we see their just abhorrent ability to take away somebody's agency and break them down. And what Zombie has done very interestingly is created the villains in the image of how in the mainstream, especially from the kind of Protestant perspective, witches embody. So, okay, here we have the evil witches. Your hocus pocus, evil, I eat children, nasty witches, Robert Edgar's the witch, you know?
Yeah.
And yet, we also see the real life thing that scared people, which were rebellious women who just flaunted the fact that they were women, they were intelligent, they were not going to be told what to think and feel because they understood better. Yes, I have skin. Yes, I have a body. No, I'm not ashamed of it. And I love that they put that in there because you have this whole like, crap, you know, like you kind of want to root for the bad guys in this movie, but then you see them taking down Heidi and how evil they are. And I just love how he has evoked things like Rosemary's Baby, but instead of going for the kooky naked people saying Hail Satan at the end of it, he's decided to be like, yeah, but the whole point of the nudity is to rebel against shame of the human body. The whole point of this strong attachment to Satan is strictly to go against their oppressors. And the rage and the evil comes from this indoctrination of abuse and trauma over the generations, and it just turns into this mania, and then they just do these horrible things out of spite. So I love that you get to dissect the kind of human aspect of this in these characters, while they're still doing terrible things. So they're still just terrifying people who commit murder, who do all kinds of nasty things, probably worse or as bad as the people that oppress them. So you kind of like, through the ways that you choose to fight things, you can become the very thing that you are fighting. And it's a story, or at least a theme, that is easily lost if you just get caught up in, it's a Rob Zombie movie.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's easy to do that. I mean, I think, especially looking at what it's taking from, I mean, you mentioned Rosemary's Baby, but, in playing off of other Polanski, it's like The Tenant and Repulsion, you can sort of feel like that maddening vibe within,
right,
like, Heidi's apartment. I mean, in the end, she ends up being sort of caught up in this chamber of sort of horror, being this once nice home is now sort of thrown to pieces, and it's in shambles, and it's very indicative and representative of sort of her mental state. But yeah, I mean, it easily could have been a story about these witches getting their revenge on, the men of the Hawthorne bloodline. And while that could have been interesting, I think it would have been a bit too overt, and I do like a lot of the subtext, and what makes this movie very rich is that you are like, yeah, I mean, this coven of women, I mean, they spit on a newborn baby and then like throw it in the fire. I mean, it details their sort of quote unquote wicked ways, but also their sort of tragic downfall. And yeah, it's a lot more clear cut that these are the villains. You're rooting for Heidi, but I also think it's sort of representative of, especially looking at Heidi's drug addiction, the way society sort of looks at addiction, the way society looks at abusers and users.
Yes.
Because I mean, like, you even have Ken Voorhees' character, who's, maybe the ringleader of their sort of disc jockey crew. Like, he's just had enough. He doesn't seem to understand it. And her one friend, Whitey, he does. And it just seems to be like, once she goes off the track, she becomes alienated from the group. And it does a really great job, I think, of separating her from society, but by having her sort of crumble and fracture and be relegated to this room. And she's being looked after by these sort of modern embodiments of these witches. And yeah, I mean, she quickly loses agency, and I'm not sure she's fully aware of it, which is what makes it even more sad.
That's a really good point. And I'm very interested in seeing this depiction of the societal theme that you're bringing up about addiction. It's like, the more we talk about it, it's like, look how layered this movie is. We're coming up with so many different readings and so many different subtleties. And I mean, you've seen it 6-7 times. I think I've seen it maybe 3 times.
Okay.
And just on this most recent one, because I was thinking about it for this podcast through aesthetics and stuff, I managed to really feel and relate to a lot of those subtleties, because it's like, you're right. It is a story about getting back at their oppressors. Indeed, could have just done it of attacking the men of Salem, but I agree with you that it would be too thin, basically. I appreciate that there's more complexity to it, that we actually explore the motivations for this, the spiraling of hate, and how that kind of like, it leads you to the wrong things. And on the other side of that, for those who empathize more on the human story, you indeed have Heidi, you have addiction, and you have all of these little subtle like microaggressions from others, and the way that somebody with addiction is treated as if they are a burden, basically, that they're just somebody who's looking for attention and not fitting in, not doing things the right way, but it's totally within their control, when addiction is a disease.
Yeah.
And it manifests in many different ways. It's not like, it's not that the substance that you become addicted to was the thing that created the addiction. You have an addiction, and then you find what feeds it, basically.
Well, and it's, hereditary, so it's just passed on through bloodline. Exactly. And in this case, I loved indeed that they explore
the loneliness that comes from struggling with something like that. But also at the same time, you are the only person who kind of understands it. So that drive that Heidi has to push everybody away. They're kind of showing the dangers of all these things. So with the Coven, they show the dangers of letting hate rule your every fiber of being and the monster that you can create by doing so. You have with Heidi the dangers of not accepting your friend's help in the time of need, of trying, there is something to be said about being strong enough to do things, but accept help. Know when you need it. And you don't always have to be the only one that's there for you. People aren't always being disingenuous when they're trying to help you, because we see it with Whitey. He's really, really trying to help. She thinks she's just probably friend-zoned and being a puppy and won't leave her alone. And I love that that's kind of there, but really he just is like, do you want to cry? That's about as much as there is to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're saying?
I was going to sort of chime in. I mean, even like the addiction angle, when you're sort of feeling, lost and sort of exposed, and in this sense, not through vulnerability of nudity or anything like that, but just sort of being exposed through, I don't know, sort of feeling defaced through one's own actions. It's right. It's really hard.
Shame, I guess.
Yeah, and it's really hard to sort of ask for help, and especially, and I mean, I would, love to sort of hear more like women's thoughts on this, but as a woman, when it comes to asking for help and seeking that, especially when the one extending a hand is, let's say a male friend, or it's, I wonder if, I'll get, like Heidi says in the film, I'll get there on my own. I wonder if there's a bigger sense of need to be one's own champion and one's own sort of shoulder to lean on. I wonder if that sense is greater as a woman in addiction, because even as a guy who deals with depression and has dealt with addiction, it's hard to ask for help. I mean, ask for help in any way. And I mean, I don't know. I think it's like I've seen this 5 times. I looked on my letterbox. The first time I've watched this was in 2018, so even sooner than I had thought. But I've seen it 5 times. You said you've seen it 3, and we're really finding so much to sort of look at and peel back with this film, that like it's anyone who thinks that it's a shallow, bloated corpse of zombies, auditorial infatuation is sort of, I think, wrong.
Absolutely. This film needs more of a reevaluation the way a lot of other films do. I think it might be a sign of the times as well, because you've also mentioned like Jennifer's Body. What was the other film from 2009 that you had mentioned?
I mentioned Halloween 2, but prior
Halloween
to that, 2. House of Wax remake in 2005.
Another one, yeah. And you were talking about how you have loved these movies from the moment that you've seen them, because you were processing them and giving them a fair shake. I do think that the type of media that we were being presented at the time, and also the horror genre in general, was just being pushed down in the muck, because honestly, I don't know why. I feel maybe it had to do with just a more conservative uptick after 9/11 kind of caused people to be like, I don't really want to deal with all this nasty stuff. And, things like torture porn. I hate to use the term because, frankly, a lot of the movies that are labeled torture porn don't really qualify with the concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But still, there was this fascination with torture. There was this fascination with dirt and grime, and no longer were we focused on the cinematic elements of horror. We really just wanted to experience nastiness, basically. And it's almost as if like a glossy version of the exploitation film kind of took over, and it wasn't done super well, and so therefore horror became a little less valuable to a lot of people. So when you get movies like this, or Jennifer's Body, where they're doing something a bit more complex, and they're trying to address stuff that we weren't really paying attention to at the time, it easily gets written off. I mean, you were even talking about how they wanted to set it in the 70s, so they decided to kind of like evoke the 70s. There's a reason for that. It's not just because, hey, I like the 70s. You can chalk it up to that, but there's a whole ethos of filmmaking there that from a filmmaker's perspective, and knowing a guy like Rob Zombie, if you know anything about him, the man's a historian. He knows so much about the things that he loves. There's a reason he can really tap into the vibe and the aesthetics of these things, is because he also knows why they were created the way they were created. So the mere fact that House of a Thousand Corpses does evoke the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not just to do it, it's to also kind of imply, like, this is how the filmmaking was, this is what I'm doing with mine, but for the modern era. I feel the same for the Lords of Salem, but in that sense, it's a kind of a timeless tale, especially since women's rights were kind of in shambles at that point, too. Women were not being listened to in the early and late 2000s and the early 2010s. We're kind of making more strides in that nowadays, but even then it's kind of quieted down by a lot of other voices.
Yeah.
So I do feel that the fact it came out in 2012 and it was ahead of its time did a lot of damage to its reputation. And I guess it didn't help that I think it was right after, not right after, but wasn't the next film after this 31?
Yeah, and that was, I think, 2016, 2015?
Something around that time. And it was pretty much panned because that kind of was the thing that Zombie was accused of a lot. But he blatantly said, oh, yeah, I've just made a movie that was violent and awesome to watch at Halloween.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes him such a versatile director, which I don't think many people would sort of label him as. But it's just like, okay, we have someone who makes something like this, and then who could also resort back to exploitative sort of schlock, I guess.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's kind of weird. You talk about 2009 and this movie coming out, maybe wrong time and place kind of thing, but I also oddly think that it may have come out in the wrong genre, which is like really weird to say because I mean, I think at this point, anyone who appreciates film knows that Rotten Tomatoes is not it doesn't represent much when it comes to what people are saying, but this film's, Rotten Tomatoes consensus is The Lords of Salem has lots of atmospheric portent, but it's unfortunately short on scares. And I just think it's really interesting that we're going to criticize and hold a film responsible for the scares when it's not really that type of film, but because it's within the horror genre, it's what we expect, and to an extent, it's what audiences want. And yeah, I don't know. That's just a poor way of going into a film.
Right. But that's what I mean with the times, by the way, because I feel like that particular pocket, so like 2001, because it is a kind of a post 9/11 phenomenon. It like 2001 to roughly 2015, when The Witch kind of came out. That's when we started to really get this recontextualization of what a horror movie could be. And the reason why there's so much pushback in terms like elevated horror is because that's just a bunch of mumbo jumbo rhetoric created by people from outside the genre who are saying, well, this doesn't suck. This isn't scary, and it's kind of cool, and it has like horror themes and stuff to it, but it's not really a horror movie. And we're like, yes, it is. The fact of the matter is there were a lot of art house horror movies in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s as well that pushed these transgressive boundaries to shake you up, to tell you about something that was quite real and threatening to you in reality, but in a fantastical way. Even your more schlocky movies in the 80s had some semblance of political criticism in there. A movie like Return of the Living Dead definitely is criticizing some of the government's practices with toxic waste and stuff in the 80s. Mm-hmm. So it's as if a lot of that kind of got lost when we got into just pure aesthetic excess, basically. It's kind of everybody really needed to get media high after the trauma experience with 9/11. Mm-hmm. So then all of the media that we got, think back to the music that we have from like 2001 to 2010, and most of it is easy to listen to, easy digestible, not necessarily happy, but even the more thought out and introspective kind of stuff has this just listenability to it. I know that's not a word, but you know what I mean? Like, it's just a digestibility to it. Mm-hmm. And I feel that films did that too. Even though they were exploring a lot of things. I mean, you look at your James Wans out there, definitely there were filmmakers who were trying to do new things, but I just feel that we as a collective consciousness just had this whole, let's put things into boxes to make life a lot more simple, because life just got really complicated for a generation that hadn't had that level of complication before.
Yeah, and I mean, especially with, the Saws and the opening up of the French Extreme, and you have Hostel. It's just like, you had an entire nation glued to the TV watching over 2,000 people die, people jumping from windows, these icons of, New York City just sort of crumble. It's just like, oh, well, we were just exposed to so much real horror that I want to go and I want to watch something that isn't, and I want to go watch someone get their Achilles heel cut and, their eyeball popped out their head. And
it's pointless. That's an important part. They are kind of like, they're entertaining, but at the end of the day, they're kind of pointless.
Yeah.
And what we have here is a filmmaker who stylistically and visually is very modern, very much of the times, and decided to tell a story the way somebody from the 70s would.
Yeah.
And people just didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think even in the 70s, a lot of those films, people didn't know what to do with it. And it got labeled, and it got sort of, put on the back burner of, like, this is sort of, I guess, all style and no substance. But I mean, the thing that I always take away from the term elevated horror is that it doesn't mean anything special. It just means that it's accessible to mainstream audiences. And I think a lot of what's out there, like what, all of a sudden breaks through, whether it's A24 or it's Orion or it's Blumhouse, which, I don't want anyone who started listening to this to get confused. This is a Blumhouse film. It's just so early. I think it's under Haunted Movies, which is what, a precursor to Blumhouse Pictures. But I mean, this is produced by Jason Blum. It feels more thoughtful, I guess, than what is being churned out now. That's kind of all I meant. But yeah, I mean, this to me, if this came out now, it wouldn't be given the term elevated horror, because I don't think that it would be for everybody. But the subject matter itself would be what a lot of films now are tapping into, and what people sort of want to view. I mean, the trauma, like, it's all there. It's just not necessarily wearing a coat of it.
Could also be a thing as well. Like, this decided to focus more on a very personal kind of trauma, as opposed to a lot of the movies at the time focusing more on like mass societal trauma, since that's what we were more or less experiencing. And you're right, this movie would have, I agree with you that it might not have been lumped into the same category because of how visually it doesn't have the A24 filter and stuff on it. Yeah. But it would thematically and narratively fit comfortably in the same conversations and the same sorts of analyses as we're doing on this podcast. I also want to touch on the Blumhouse thing before we wrap up, because I want to make it clear, like, I am a huge supporter of them, and I think it's good to be critical of the things that you support, because then they can always evaluate what people are kind of craving. And so kudos and love to Jason Blum for putting that passion for horror there. The fact that this was from the same studio, but the earlier versions of it, it shows like where the intent and mentality for a company like Blumhouse comes from. But kind of do that Marvel comparison to it, and I can't say that Marvel's not passionate about their own properties either. It's just when you're trying to create a business model to appeal to as wide of an audience as possible and make things palatable, you're going to produce a lot of things. And a lot of those things are not going to be made for everybody. And Blumhouse is doing the work. They're actually creating, which is hard work. It's hard to make a movie that is widely appealing and not necessarily meant for the people who want to get those really in-depth stories and have a lot of auteurship in their film and let the reins go free on a director. But they do it from time to time. You do get movies like Freaky that, although tonally still fit with all the other films that they make that are really mainstream, was just so unique in itself. Because that movie, you could tell they didn't really have a lot of studio involvement in it. They were happy with what it was going to be, but it does address a lot of these issues in a modern way. You know, the future generations are going to process media differently than we did, and then the people who came before us. So I just want to make it clear, like, if we're critical, not at all a critique on the fact that they do what they do, not at all to say that there's lack of quality in the things that they produce. Blumhouse has produced some of the best horror films of the last 2 decades, and they're going to continue to do so. It's just along the way. Not everything's going to be for everybody, and I think that we're just the types of people that we're much more invested in watching an artist create something without there being any sort of financial agenda or anything to it. But there is a place for that, and I'm really happy that Blumhouse is out there making mainstream swings with horror to kind of remind everybody that, remember the 90s when horror was like normal?
Yeah.
Like, it was in every type of media that we had, and because of that, we had the same things. We had these movies that were popcorn flicks that you didn't care about. We also had plenty of movies that just shook us to our core and terrified us. And to another point, as you were saying, I'm going to say this really clearly to everybody listening, okay? Horror does not equal scary.
Yeah.
That's what you want, and that's fine. You can want what you want, but that does not define the entire genre, all right? So, and also scary is subjective.
Yeah, and also, you know, just sort of going back to, in defense of Blumhouse, I might not like a lot of the stuff that they make, but I also like David D. Coteau movies. So I don't know, like what do I know? I mean, in 20 years, I hope somebody finds Ma and they're like, wow, this is trashy and glorious, and I love it. The same way I look at Final Stab 20 plus years later, you know?
There you go. Yeah, I mean, I can't look back at my love of a movie like Biodome and not say, and then with a straight face say to people like, I have the best taste in the world. No, I have my taste. Yeah. And I can't tell you why I love some of the things that I love. I just do. And so for anybody out there who's just like, oh, but you're naming all these movies that I love, we do not mean to tear you down in your taste. Your taste is beautiful.
Keep loving them.
Keep loving it. And the best thing you can do is share that love. Stop sharing your hatred so much. We don't really care what you dislike. There are plenty of movies I dislike. I'm going to keep that to myself as much as I can because, frankly, you need to hear about the things that I love so we can connect a little bit more, people. Let's do that. Let's share these things. And if you didn't like this movie, let's say you pick it up after we've talked about it, I just hope that you see what we were talking about, whether you liked it or not, because all I want to do with this is just enrich your viewing experiences because there's a lot of rich film out there.
And yeah, I mean, I hope anybody who watches this and has a completely different opinion from the two of us, I would love to hear it. I love it when, you know, opposing or contrasting opinions are expressed, obviously expressed in a particular way, but yeah, you know,
respectfully.
Yeah, I like hearing, you know, opposing viewpoints. So if anybody watches this and they don't take away what we have put out there in this podcast, I would still love to hear it.
Absolutely. You know, I think we've touched upon not the totality, but I think just a very good amount of what this film has to offer. So I don't know about you, but I think we could wrap up. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. We've really sort of tapped into what the Lords has to offer.
Yeah. All right. Well, then I'm going to wrap up real quick, and that means that this podcast is a part of the Anatomy of a Scream Pod Squad. Be sure to follow the Anatomy of a Scream podcast page on your preferred podcast platform to check out more introspective, semi-academic, and fun podcasts, including The Scream Teens, hosted by Gory Corey and Lena, The Road to Nowhere, hosted by RC Hara, and much more. You can find more info at anatomyofascream.com. If you are interested in more of my musings on beauty in horror or horror in general, you can follow me on Twitter, which is @_Shockaholic. You can also check out my website, which is shockaholic.org. So, dear listeners, what are your thoughts on the Lords of Salem? Just like Greg, I also love to hear opposing views, and you can always shout those out to me on Twitter, which is @BeautyHorrorPod, so things specifically for this podcast, or email me at beautyofhorrorpod@gmail.com, and there's also our Discord as well, if you just want to have a more lively and continuous discussion, I suppose. I want to thank you again, Greg, for this awesome discussion about a film that I it just means a lot to me to really be able to talk about it with somebody in this way, because there are not enough people in my environment, at least in my daily interpersonal environment, let's put it that way, my physical environment, that share this opinion. Plenty online, but there's a difference in talking voice to voice with somebody about it. So I appreciate that.
Of course.
And I want to know, like, where can people find you, and is there anything coming up that you would like to plug and get their attention about?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram as ReelBrew, REEL. I've got a piece I'm trying to wrap up on Scream 2 for its December 8th anniversary. I'm writing a piece on Vanilla Sky for its 20th anniversary. That will be a part of my Best of the Best column over at Talk Film Society, which has been in limbo for about 2 years. So I'm excited to sort of get back to that, but also celebrate a film that I really love and that is getting its 20th anniversary. So hopefully that will expose people to it. And then I'm also working on a podcast that you mentioned at the beginning of the show called Lovin Uwe, which is me tackling the films of Eagle Bowl, and I have not seen a single one of his movies. And I know that this is going to be something I might regret, but I thought that it would just be something of a fascination to sort of tackle it. And yeah, hopefully once the first 2 or 3 films get underway, I will, get some guests.
Well, I definitely look forward to this. I've seen not a lot of his filmography, but enough, like 3 or 4 films. And there is a very unique persona behind these films that seems to guide people's feelings on it. So I'm very curious, especially after our discussion today, to hear what you're going to experience with these movies. And you may regret it, but you may not. Maybe you find that there's maybe some of those are worth reevaluation. I don't know if I'm confident in saying that, but I'm very curious.
I don't think you should be.
And also, so where could everybody find that article on Scream 2? Or what platform would that be through?
I'm hoping to get it on Daily Grindhouse because it was originally supposed to come out in October, but I dropped the ball on finishing it. So, they had first dibs. I would love to get it through to them. But yeah, if not, maybe my own blog, which is Real Brew blog. It's a WordPress. It's nothing fancy. But yeah, so hopefully that gets to be seen through Daily Grindhouse because they're a site that I love championing and just sort of, want to always be a part of.
Great. So be sure to check out those platforms and follow all of Greg's ventures. Thanks again. And of course, thank you, dear listener, for joining us in talking about the beauty that lurks within the horrible. Goodbye.